This is a presentation that I was asked to give at a members lecture back in June. And following that, it was then suggested to me that I present it to staff. So thank you for showing up, so I have at least somebody to talk to. Before we get started, though, I do want to kind of get a sense of the level of knowledge for geology in y'all. So anybody here with a PhD in geology? Master's degree? But BS. Anybody see more than 10 episodes of Flintstones? Okay, well, so I have a few people equivalent to what my level of knowledge is. So what we're going to do today is we're going to have a brief overview of the last 4.54 billion years. We're going to talk about the shape of Pennsylvania's landscapes. What is biogeography? Actually, I wanted to title this talk Biogeography, and the IA people wouldn't let me. So therefore, the title that they came up with, which is on the first slide. How is Pennsylvania's flora and fauna described using biogeography? What does all of this mean for conservation? And then if there is any time, we can have some questions and discussion. So what is biogeography? Well, I have three expert definitions here. One from Oxford. You can read that branch of biology that deals with the geographic distribution of plants and animals. Wikipedia says the study of the distribution of species, organisms, and ecosystems in geographic space and through geologic time. And then this Bier fellow says, just think about it as the patterns of the distribution of plants, animals, other life forms, and their habitats across the earth. Okay? You already know something about biogeography. Here are some examples. You know that penguins are only found in the southern hemisphere. You also know that elephants, at least now, are only found in Africa and Asia. And this group of mammals, called the marsupials, there are 434 species of them. 70% of those, these are the kangaroos and the wallabies and so forth, 70% of those are in Australia. And only one here in North America. Which one is that? The opossum. So that's really a pattern that's pretty distinctive. And then a pattern more of habitats or biomes, for example, the tundra. The tundra is found at least either at very high latitudes up in the Arctic Circle or high elevations, and it will come actually down the mountain chains on the tops of some of the mountains that are high enough to create the conditions for that type of habitat. So there's some examples. I think you probably all knew those. So what are the factors that govern biogeography? A lot of it has to do with the past history of the Earth, various geologic events. And then there are other features of the Earth, such as major watershed divides. We'll talk about that a little bit later. That creates separate basins and actually separates species over time. Climate is a big factor, and also how it changes over time. Human influences, recent and long ago. Chance events of species or species groups. Evolutionary events and the formation of new species. And then there's a lot that's still sort of mysterious out there, and actually there's a great scientific debate on the importance of Noah's Ark in biogeography. So keep that in mind. A few summary points on the history of the Earth. The Earth is very old, much has happened. Geologic history has been dynamic, but often very, very slow, and it's kind of hard to get our minds wrapped around how many years have actually gone by with the Earth changing over time. Geologists have names for periods of time when distinctive things were happening. Mountains come and go via building and erosion. Seas come and go and make rocks and minerals. Soils are developed from surface bedrock and vary, or at least usually they're made from surface bedrock. And some of the shaping of Pennsylvania has been as recent as 20,000 years ago. So I want you to think of the Earth as an onion, just made up of different layers, and each of these layers represents a different event in the geologic past. So you can see a layer right through here, other layers down through here. This is a simplification, but it's one way you can at least try to think about the Earth. This is not exactly quite true. I'll just describe a little later, but this is a simple model. And you generally have horizontal layers with the oldest rock created earliest in Earth's history, lowest in the cross-section, and then the younger rock above, and then often other material above that. So here's our staff conducting a study on valley seeps. This was along 20 Mile Creek in Erie County. Oh, well, you have to do science. So here's a map of the surface geology of Pennsylvania. You see the different colors there, and they all relate to the different periods of time in the Earth's history. Those are located down here. You can see they all have different names. And this is significant because, again, remember the surface rock develops the soil at that site and provides other characteristics of particular places. The pattern here is that, generally speaking, the rock is older in this area and gets younger as you move across the state. Here's another chart of the same thing. These are the different periods that the geologists use to talk about the Earth. And to give you an example of how these vary and how it's important to recognize different portions of the Earth. This area where we mostly live is a Pennsylvania period. You can see it here, 323 million years ago until about 290 million years ago. This is when the coals were formed. These layers consist largely of sandstone, so that builds certain types of soil. You get certain species occurring on the habitats that develop from those soils. You can see this group here called the Mississippian, which is older than the Pennsylvania. So in many places, the Pennsylvania is sitting on top of the Mississippian. So that's how you can think about this also. In the Mississippian period, there were lots of limestones formed. Also some other sandstones, but limestones as well. The Valley and Ridge part of Pennsylvania, you can see all the squiggles in here. This is a very dynamic part of the state. But the tops of the ridges, of a lot of the ridges in that area, and you've seen these as you drive across the turnpike, are capped with a sandstone that was developed in the Silurian age, mostly Tuscarora sandstone, a very brittle, hard sandstone. And then you'll notice up here in center in Huntington County, see that little bit of orange right there? I don't know if you can see that or not. But that's some rock that's at the surface there of the Cambrian period. And that's significant because some of those strata are what we call, or what the geologists call, the Gatesburg Formation. And it has another kind of limestone called dolomite. And it creates a very interesting set of habitats, including vernal pools in sinkholes, and also pitch pine scrub oak barrens in places like State Game Lands 176 outside of State College, the Scotia area. This is what's been referred to as a supercontinent. It formed about 300 million years ago, and it's where all of the continents came together into, again, what they call a supercontinent for about 100 million years. This is a very significant event in Earth's history for a number of reasons. And you can see how the continents are sort of fitting together there. And you can see that North America and Africa were at one time touching. But they were separate before this took place. So when they came together, there are huge continental plates under these continents. Hopefully you've heard and thought a little bit about that term previously. But just big slabs of the earth that move. And when they came together, they put a lot of pressure on North America, and that was actually is what created the Appalachian Mountains. We'll talk more about that. But if you can just imagine these continents slowly colliding into each other and what the result of that would be. And then over time, beginning about 220 million years ago, the continents started to break up. So here they are. Hard to recognize who's who, but you'll see some that you recognize soon. There they are together. Starting to move apart. Here you can see North America is leaving Africa. Asia hasn't quite come over yet. The South Pole has not. The Antarctic continent has not gone its distance. You can also see that at certain times there were great inland seas across portions of these continents. And then they eventually have moved out to essentially where we would recognize them today. Now there are some ramifications of that part of Earth's history because those continents were together during a critical time. At that time, Pennsylvania was also slid across the globe and was actually very close to the equator. So lots of the coal layers were being developed at that time. But there were a number of species that were created during those 100 million years. And that's in part why we have similar species living on different continents today. And the ramification of that is that because there are species like oaks in North America and also oaks in Europe, and because we have ashes, you can see the pumpkin ash leaf down here in North America, but also Asia has ash trees. And what it means is that a pest species, if it can get across the ocean to the similar species found on that other continent, it is closely enough related to this new species that it can impact it. So the ashes of the world, some of them, even though they haven't been together for a while, they're still very similar. And they're similar enough that a pest like the emerald ash borer can impact trees that we have, for example, in North America. The same thing happened with the American chestnut over on the left. Because it was closely related to the Chinese chestnut that it had originally evolved with. And then when it separated, it actually did develop into a new species over time, but was not far enough removed to have developed a system that would be unpalatable to the fungus that eventually came when we imported Chinese chestnuts and brought the fungus into North America. So here's some of that, that mountain building process. You might think of this as if you had kind of a throw rug on the floor and you ran up to it and tried to slide on it and got it all rumpled up. That's basically part of the mountain building processes. You can see that happening over here where the layers get all kind of screwed up. This is very common down in central Pennsylvania. This is part of, this shows you Sidling Hill and Rays Hill and so forth that you have seen when you travel the turnpike. There are also faults that occur where there will be slippage, where one plate might slip on another and create forces. This is very interesting. I wish it was a better photograph, but this is in Sidling Hill in Maryland, where they cut through Sidling Hill, and you can see the folds created here. What this means is that a stratum such as this darker one here, if it was occurring where the sediments were all flat, it would have no influence on the surface of the earth. But because of this fold, it actually comes up and now can be eroded away into soil and into rock and be part of the creation of habitats. So again, soils usually develop their characteristics from the bedrock that they're sitting on, or bedrock that was recently eroded away. Sometimes they slip down slopes, but otherwise that's the basic principle. So geologists also look at Pennsylvania in terms of these physiographic sections. So each of these different colors and the names have different characteristics. Again, here we are over here in the Pittsburgh Plateau section. It's a part of Pennsylvania that was developed. The bedrock is horizontal. Again, those Pennsylvania period rocks are very common in this area. We have the Allegheny Mountains here, where very similar strata are present, but they were folded into large sine waves. If you go a little further east, you have the valley, the ridge and valley area of the Appalachian Mountains. These were more abruptly folded layers and layers of older type rock. Here we have the high plateau. So these are all different. They all have different characteristics, and we'll talk a little bit about those. For example, in the high plateau, generally the height here is all, the tops are above 2,000 feet, and those tops are relatively flat. So this would be up in places like Warren, McKean counties, Potter County, parts of Clinton County, the high plateau. So this land was lifted up just generally without any folds, without any faults, just lifted up over time to even a higher elevation that was eroded out somewhat. These habitats are generally acidic. They're derived from sandstones, the soils. Because it's higher latitude but also higher elevation, they're cooler and are usually quite moist. And then here's a look at, again, the mountains. So you can see up here in the plateaus, they're dissected by streams, but other than that, the geology is fairly simple in terms of what the surface is showing you, in terms of the number of types of bedrock, and also the structure of that bedrock. And then you have the mountains. We have basically two types of mountains, and keeping in mind that Mount Washington here in Pittsburgh is not a mountain. That's just something people call it. We have two types of mountains. These are the Allegheny Mountains right here in the Laurel Highlands. Here's Allegheny Front. This is the mountain that you go through in the first tunnel on the turnpike as you're going west to east. This is Negro Mountain here, Laurel Hill and Chestnut Ridge, again making up the Allegheny Mountains. Very similar rock to here, but it has been folded. Over here is a very crazy section of the state. I can't really explain to you how all of this was formed, other than this is part of what happened when North America and Africa came together and forced these giant folds, which are actually much higher, and some geologists believe at one time they were even higher than the Rocky Mountains are today, and then over time have just eroded away. Again, you have to try to think. Time allows just about anything to happen if there's enough of it. Here's an example of the Ridge and Valley. It's one of the Conservancy's largest projects at Cherry Run's now Game Lands. This is up in southern Clinton County and part of Center County. So you can see those folds. These folds are not as high as the Allegheny Mountains, and they're not as broad, but they're more dynamic. So we developed these patterns of life. The black-throated blue warbler likes to live where there are rhododendron. Where do you find rhododendron? cool, moist habitats. Where are those cool, moist habitats most likely? They're either northern or they're down the mountains. So you start to see this T distribution in a number of species. The magnolia warbler, that's a bird that is often found around hemlock, eastern hemlock. This is also a political pattern in Pennsylvania, but I can't explain that. And then the northern raven has a little different pattern. Again, it's really a bird of wild places, and you find especially a lot of that up here, and then down through the mountains, but it doesn't quite make the T because this area is fairly fragmented. I don't know if it ever occurred over this way in northwestern Pennsylvania. Another example, these data are from the recent Breeding Bird Atlas. These are our two chickadee species. And you can see the Carolina chickadee is basically a bird of warmer, lower elevation habitats, while the black-capped chickadee dominates Pennsylvania, a little bit of that T distribution pattern. And it's interesting to note that these two birds come together right here in Pittsburgh. It's kind of their area of juncture. In terms of plants, other patterns of distribution, you can see some of our plants are very limited. Here are two plants that are found essentially exclusively in the Allegheny Mountains, the Laurel Highlands. Also, the smooth azalea has its strongest component to its distribution in the Allegheny Mountains. Some of these other places I don't think exist anymore. And then another sort of T distribution with the painted trillium being more adapted to cool, moist environments, one of the species that we actually have at Bear Run Nature Reserve. Again, these are the more massive, longer sine wave folded mountains. This is where we have our highest point in the state. These mountains are all just generally higher than the ones to the east. So upheaval called the Appalachian Revolution. Must have been an exciting time. Another interesting feature of the Allegheny Mountains is that there's this major river. Actually, there are a couple of them, but the Castleman River comes north out of Maryland, and the Youghiogheny River, they're both flowing north. And along with the Monongahela, just a few streams that actually flow north. So what does that do? Well, it comes through all this very resistant sandstone, so it creates, and it's dropping down to join the Monongahela at McKeesport out in the Pittsburgh plateaus. So generally it's falling from the Allegheny Mountains and eventually into the Pittsburgh plateaus, and that drop has caused it to cut down and continues to cut down over this very resistant sandstone that's found down the Alleghenies, down the Laurel Highlands. This is largely Pottsville sandstone. This northward flowing river means that we also have some plants that live along this river that have basically come north along the river over time. And they're found nowhere else in Pennsylvania. If you want to find them elsewhere, you go down into West Virginia and Virginia. They include Marshallia or barber's buttons, the Travataria, Carolina tasselroot? Is that right? Okay. And then the buffalo nut. And here's the distribution for that last one. And you can see it's very, very localized in this area. Another interesting animal, an example of kind of a Appalachian distribution, is this salamander called the green salamander. It's one that we've studied quite a bit here. It's one of the climbing salamanders, and the distribution or the pattern of distribution for this group of salamanders, they're all of the genus Aeneades, called the climbing salamanders. They have these expanded toe tips, which have little papillae on them for climbing up surfaces. They can go right up a vertical surface. They're also compressed dorsoventrally, and there are 5 species in North America. 4 of them live in the Pacific Northwest. One of them, the cloud salamander, climbs up into redwood trees, and that's its habitat. It might live its whole life up in the redwood trees. Our species is adapted to live in rock habitats. This is its range. You can see we're right at the northern limit. This kind of looks like a contracting range. I mean, it's over here in Indiana, southern Ohio, some other outliers. So at one point it might have been a wider distributed species, but now this is its pattern. In Pennsylvania, only found in Fayette County, where it lives in Pottsville sandstone almost entirely. The Pottsville sandstone was formed during the Pennsylvania period, and there's one part of the Pottsville called the Homewood Formation. It sits at the very top. The Pottsville is about 300 feet thick. The top 90 feet is the Homewood Formation, and it forms these huge cliffs and blocks of sandstone that have crevices in them. And when there's the right microclimate, you can find the green salamander. Now, it's interesting that this species is only found on Chestnut Ridge. If you remember the ridges, there was Allegheny Front, Negro Mountain, Laurel Hill, and Chestnut Ridge. And it comes up out of West Virginia and inhabits a number of places on Chestnut Ridge until you get to the Youghiogheny River. This is the gorge of the Yauk, where it's cutting through Chestnut Ridge. And for some reason, from what we know so far, this is a range barrier for the distribution of this species. In other words, you can be right here looking at a green salamander and on the south side of the river, Ohiopyle being back there, and this is flowing to Connellsville. And you can look across and actually see some rock outcrops on this side of the river, and you can go over there and search, and we have not been able to find the green salamander on the other side of the Youghiogheny River. So the hypothesis is that they are unable to make it down here, get in a raft, go across the river, cross the railroad track, and get into this habitat, which seems to be very similar. But stay tuned, that may change. So again, let's look at this map. Plateaus with horizontally bedded bedrock, so kind of very similar kinds of soils in here. This is a bit of a difference. At one time there was a different inland sea sitting here down in Greene and Washington counties, so they call this the Waynesburg Hills. Soils there are a little richer, it's a little more limestone in there. And then the mountains, the Allegheny Mountains, the very significantly folded valley and ridge section. In the southern part of the valley and ridge, and that would be down in here, there's a place I call the shale country. And this is where you have Devonian period shales on slopes. And when you have the slope in the right configuration above a stream and it's facing predominantly south, you get these very hot, what we refer to as the eastern deserts. The rainfall here is still similar to the area surrounding it, so that's not different. It's just the exposure of these soils. The surface temperature can get up to about 140 degrees. And so there are some plants that are found there that are adapted to live in that kind of situation. So in Pennsylvania, we actually have a cactus, the prickly pear cactus. We have focused in on some of these habitats to protect them because they're very unusual and they have a number of rare and endangered species. So these are photos of our Sidling Hill Creek Barrens natural area, also known as the Brassfield Tract, sitting above Sidling Hill Creek right here. I think these are a couple of Chris's photographs. You can see the junipers up on these slopes. That's red cedar juniper. This is another species that's found, Catspaw Ragwort. It's an endangered species. We have a small population on that tract. It has very kind of fuzzy leaves and stems, apparently to help it not to desiccate in this very hot environment. What was that? I think that was a tectonic plate shift. We actually did feel an earthquake here last year. We were right in this room. Limestone is also another very driving characteristic of certain habitats and certain distributions of species. These are where limestones occur in Pennsylvania. However, some of these limestones, most of them right in here, actually are covered by other bedrock. But if you get out into this, again, folded area where the strata have been shifted and folded, some of those limestones actually come to the surface. And because of erosion patterns, the limestones are generally found in valleys and on lower slopes. But they certainly drive different kinds of habitats and the distribution of unique species again. 2 endangered species in Pennsylvania that are found in these habitats, the tall larkspur and Canby's mountain lover. This is actually at a natural area that we have in Bedford County. So let's turn our focus then to the northwestern part of the state for a moment, just talk about that. This is the glaciated section. So here's the line where the Wisconsin Glacier, there have been a number of glacial periods over time. The last one is referred to as the Wisconsin. The one before that was about, I think it was 80,000 years prior to that, was the Illinois Glacier. Then you have the Kansas and Nebraska glaciers coming before that. But at any rate, the Wisconsin is the last one that left its mark on Pennsylvania. Lake Erie is the result of that glacier eventually departing. And again, to try to get your head around some of these concepts, we're talking about continental ice sheets. Here's some mountain glaciers, montane glaciers that exist, and they still sort of operate the way the continental glaciers did, but these continental glaciers were so massive that the comparison between those and the glaciers that exist today is almost insignificant. There are places in the Wisconsin Glacier that they think were a mile thick. So if you can think of a mile of ice sitting on top of the land and slowly moving across Canada, out of Canada, and into the northern US. Again, just one of those concepts to try to get your head around. And but this was a very significant event, all of these glaciations were, to the point that they would even put so much weight and pressure on the land that they could start to create folds in what would otherwise have been horizontal strata of shales. I think this is either Pete or Chris's photo in Elk Creek in Erie County. And it's believed to be a representation of the stress that the glaciers put on parts of northwestern Pennsylvania. So here's a representation of those ice sheets. Again, they came out of Canada. They came into both northwestern Pennsylvania and also over northeastern Pennsylvania, but of course we work mostly over here. The glacier would advance and retreat. There's a certain number of those that happened. I think there were 4 major ones during the Wisconsin, but you can see again how it came down here into Pennsylvania. And it's the significance includes that at one time, okay, you see where you are here, Pennsylvania, here's Pittsburgh. At one time, the Monongahela River came north, as it does now, and it joined this stream right in here, what referred to as Lower Allegheny, and then continued on as the Monongahela River up this way into the ancestral Lake Erie Basin. Meanwhile, there was a separate, you see these are not joined, a separate stream, they're calling the Middle Allegheny, that also is north. This is actually French Creek of today. And then there was an Upper Allegheny River, and these were not attached. By the time this continental glacier came down, it actually forced these to flow south. They ended up joining up. So here's French Creek of today, the Upper Allegheny, which not showing all of it here, and then joining up with what is now the Beaver River, all forced to come together to form the Ohio as we see it today. So that's a pretty major change in drainage patterns. The glacier brought with it material out of Canada. So there's a lot of material in northwestern Pennsylvania on the surface of the land, almost all of it, that is not native. If you can find native rock underneath, like at Elk Creek there that we saw. But the glacier brought down a lot of metamorphic rock like granite, igneous rock like granite, and some metamorphic rocks, schists and whatever, that were not formed here in Pennsylvania. These were also washed downstream all the way into the Ohio River. So all through the Allegheny River, you can reach down at the bottom of the river and pull up a piece of rounded off granite. And that granite was formed hundreds of miles to the north in Canada, is where it originated. In part, this has created ecosystems that would have been different without this event taking place. French Creek, as part of the Ohio Basin, has a rich fauna of freshwater mussels and also fishes. And they like to live in gravel, and they like to have lots of resources of water supply. So if the stream dries out, gets too warm in the summer, they can basically die out. But because of this glacial landscape, they're able to find a tremendous amount of groundwater stored in the glacial material that's left on top of the land. And then that structure of lots of sand and gravel. The other thing that they brought with them as part of all that material was a lot of limestone, which creates alkaline or high pH type habitats, both in the streams, and these freshwater mussels are building their shells out of calcium carbonate. So that's another important feature of some of these streams. So what this means is, I was telling you before that usually soils relate to the bedrock or a recent bedrock that was at that site. But in the case of the northwestern Pennsylvania, the soils relate more to, in a lot of places, to the glacial material left by the Wisconsin and the Illinois Glacier. And so these patterns look more similar than the bedrock does to those soil types. It's also a place where we find some distinct wetlands. We usually refer to these as calcareous fens. There are also some calcareous swamps up in this area, but it's all based on the fact that there's a lot of groundwater that's influenced by the limestone that was delivered by the glacier. So here's a photo of a place that we protected called Wattsburg Fen Natural Area. If you look at the distribution of this, I think this is endangered. It's either endangered or threatened in Pennsylvania. This is the showy lady slipper, which is a calciphile, which means it lives in environments that are rich in calcium. So this is the wetland where it lives. And if you look at the distribution of it on a map in Pennsylvania, again, it would focus in very tightly to either the northwest glaciated areas or some other places in Pennsylvania where there are those surface limestones and groundwater producing habitats that allow it to survive. Another interesting feature about the glaciation, it has formed essentially all of our natural lakes. Most of the things we call lakes in Pennsylvania are not lakes, they're dammed streams. So here you can see a dam on a stream floods the valley. That's not really a lake. That's a flooded valley, but we call them lakes. Out of bodies of water, 20 acres or more in size in Pennsylvania, the fact is that there are about 2,500 of those, but there are only about 80 of those that are natural. So in the western part of the state, this is basically a photo showing you most of the larger bodies of water. You can see Pymatuning Reservoir, there's Raystown Lake, Allegheny, and then lots of other places that we've dammed up streams. But here are the natural ones. There's just that many, including Lake Pleasant that we've worked to protect, and then Lake LaBeouf, Edinburgh Lake, Canadota Lake, Conneaut Lake, Sugar Lake, and Sandy Lake. And those are the natural lakes in Pennsylvania. What's significant about that? These are totally different ecosystems. I can't go into a lot of explanation, but they are sitting in depressions left by the glacier. They're sitting in a landscape where the groundwater's feeding them. Again, this calcareous groundwater. So at one point, there was a chunk of ice that broke off from the end of the glacier. These could be huge chunks of ice. Remember, this thing is a mile thick. Glacial material ended up developing and covering over the surface. As the glacier was melting, there was a lot of outwash that pushed materials out from under the glacier and from the top of the glacier. These were actually big, dirty sheets of ice as they had been grinding along their way. And then essentially, when that melted, it ended up with a depression. That's a simplification of the formation of a glacial lake. So this is the one that we've been particularly focused on. Lake Pleasant in Erie County. There's no comparison between the biodiversity richness of this site and some of those impoundments, those streams that were impounded, that were dammed up. So there are 24 species in these wetlands and in the lake that are species of special concern. They're so uniquely found in these systems, they're really quite rare. This is a cool one, Bexwater marigold. It's an aquatic plant that's rooted in the bottom of the lake. It's actually in the sunflower family, or the aster family. You can see that what that flower looks like. And it comes up through the water and then actually grows above the water and opens its flower bud. So that's what you're seeing here. And it has different kinds of leaves. It has aerial leaves and it has submerged leaves when it's living down the water. An endangered species in Pennsylvania. Related to that period of time is something called the Pleistocene extinctions. You remember before we said that the biogeography pattern, biogeographical pattern of elephants in the world is Asia and Africa. Well, that's today. At one time there were other elephants in North America. But it's very interesting that they believe that there was a rash of extinctions of about 33 species of large mammals that were at one time in North America. But when, at glacial maximum, when a lot of the water on the earth was part of this continental glacier and lowered the sea level, they believe people came across from Asia to populate North America for the first time. They called them the Clovis People. And they also believed that this was a new predator coming to North America for the first time, and that a lot of these species did not recognize these people as being predators And also, of course, they were intelligent humans that had tools, and they were able to take down quite a few of these mammals. So there were all of these: American horses, camels, stag, moose, shrub ox, Arctic musk ox. You can see the list, including the woolly mammoth and the American mastodon, peccaries and so forth. These are all missing. And the paleontologists believe that there's a real linkage between the arrival of these people. So maybe our first kind of screw up of all the biogeography and biodiversity in, you thought that that was a recent occurrence. No. There's a lot of evidence that it was related to the arrival of these people. And in the late 1990s, a woolly mammoth skeleton was actually removed from the bottom of Lake Pleasant. I think it's still at the University of Michigan. And there was evidence of human predation on that mammoth skeleton, is what the experts, the professor from Michigan has told us. Cut marks on the legs. They pulled the brain out for making brain soup or whatever they did with that. But pretty cool. I mentioned drainage basins being important for biogeography, explaining biogeography. And mostly what we're talking about is this major divide, using Pennsylvania as an example. This line right here is the Upper Ohio River, which is part of what is usually referred to as the interior basin, includes the Mississippi River, the Missouri River, and so forth. If you're on the other side of this line, which you can be by driving the turnpike and going through the first tunnel, you are in what's generally referred to as the Atlantic slope drainages, which include the Susquehanna, the St. Lawrence system through the Great Lakes, the Delaware, all flowing out to the Atlantic Ocean. So this is a giant separation of water moving over time. So what does that mean? If you look at the patterns of life, the distribution, the biogeography of certain groups of animals, for example, freshwater mussels, you'll see a very distinctive pattern. The interior basin, the Ohio drainage, the Cumberland River, and the Mississippi and so forth, are known to be some of the richest large basin ecosystems in terms of biodiversity in the world. And in terms of freshwater mussels, this group, very rich. If you're on the other side of that line, in the Atlantic slope, in the Susquehanna River, the mighty Susquehanna, right? Huge river. And the Delaware is sizable. You see a real differential between the number of species. So the Ohio River in Pennsylvania has records for about 54 different species of freshwater mussels. And then compare that to these Atlantic slope basins. Susquehanna, only 9, Potomac 7, Delaware 10. And then here's where the explanation kind of falls apart, or here's where the pattern needs more explanation. The St. Lawrence drainage having 22 species. So what's that all about? It's been explained by scientists as resulting from, during lake glaciation, water being shared between the basically the Ohio basin and the St. Lawrence, what will become the St. Lawrence system, due to the melting glaciers backing up a lot of water. They're melting, right? A mile thick ice sheet is melting. Where's all that water go? Well, it went up right to the divide between it and the Ohio River, and then in certain places, it would break through that and actually connect the two. And so it was the potential conduit then for species from the Ohio system and the Mississippi system to get into what was becoming now the St. Lawrence system. So what you find are a number of species here that actually, scientists believe, originated in the Ohio system and then moved into the St. Lawrence. Now, freshwater mussels use fish as their hosts, right? The young have to attach to a fish, and then they get moved using the fish, because these guys don't walk very far. And so you'd have to assume then that those fishes also made that same trip. And this has all been studied. There's still some remaining questions about it, but it's been studied pretty well. And Nevin, maybe you can help me remember. I can only think of one species out of these 22 that's actually a St. Lawrence. The pond mussel, Legumia nasuta, and I think.
And then the only other one would be Elliptio complanata, which I think has a weird distribution over in Michigan somehow.
Okay. Okay. We don't have that one in Lake Erie, but
right.
Yeah. And another interesting comparison is that, remember, look at these numbers here. There's a total of about 66 species of freshwater mussels in Pennsylvania. And only 2 of them are shared across this line. People have moved a couple of them, but apparently, naturally, only 2 of them have been shared across that line. So there's some explaining to do there, but it's more than we can go into today. Something I think we take for granted are fireflies. The distribution of fireflies, the biogeography is that this is an insect of eastern North America. Actually, there are hundreds of species, and they're not just from the New World or North America, but just talking about the ones found in the US. If you grew up in the plains and over into California, chances are you didn't have fireflies as part of your childhood, because here they are all kind of locked up in the east. So that's a certain pattern that kind of has enriched our sense of place here. We have probably about 20 species of fireflies in Pennsylvania. And what is our state insect? Photinus pennsylvanica, the Pennsylvania firefly. Something else I started looking into a while ago was just how has Pennsylvania geology influenced conservation, for example, the conservation of forests. And if you compare these 2 kind of generalized features of Pennsylvania geology, high plateaus and mountains, and low elevations in landscapes, essentially valleys. The high plateaus and mountains are generally more acidic, rockier, steeper slopes, harsher weather, and cheaper land. At lower elevations and in the valleys, remember those Mississippian limestones that are at the surface? That's where they're at the surface for the most part. The soils are rich and deep, and the slopes are they're actually gentle. There's more favorable weather, but over time, that's been the most expensive land and has been needed for other human uses. Brad and I looked at this a few years ago, and I said, Brad, you GIS wizard, take the state and cut it off at 1,200 feet. I just picked that number. And that number really doesn't function as well in certain parts of the state as others, but just cut it off, turn the state sideways, lie it down, and slice it through, and what's it look like? So the green here are all the low elevation areas below 1,200 feet. And that represents about 45% of the state. And then here you have 55% is above 1,200 feet. And these are the areas that are mostly, again, they're higher elevation, they're rockier, they're steeper, they're folded. And then we looked at where forest has been conserved in Pennsylvania. And here was the pattern. These gray blotches are either up in the high plateau for the most part, or they're found on the ridges. And look here at this area. And here's South Mountain. We've protected those forests. But they're the higher, rockier ones. Okay, so what? Well, we really need to understand patterns, large patterns and small patterns to do our job. Patterns of forest, the large basins that we work with, and then small patterns of distribution of animals, like here's the Massasauga rattlesnake that lives in the crayfish burrows. And this is all important also to lead us down the road of continuing our conservation work in the face of climate change. So a lot of you have probably seen this summer heat index change map. And basically they're saying, depending on what the emission scenario is, whether it's the lower or the higher, that Western Pennsylvania is either going to feel like northern Alabama late this century, or maybe just, if things work out a little better, maybe more like parts of Kentucky and Virginia, but definitely going to change. The predictions include changes in precipitation patterns, drier summers, wetter winters, and generally more dynamic weather. This is an example put together by a forest ecologist, biometrician at Penn State, looking at the different species of trees in Pennsylvania and how this is sort of like the climate vulnerability index that our heritage staff did, but sort of predicting what might happen with the tree species in Pennsylvania. And basically, what he said was, these are probably not going to be in Pennsylvania in the future. These are kind of at least going to decline. These might be all right, but they're probably going to move a little bit. And then down at this end, here's some species that aren't in Pennsylvania right now, but probably will be in the future. And these are some species that probably will increase. So kind of a mix of predictions. Likely to significantly decline or depart, including this economically very important species and our state tree. Another aspect of all this, of course, is that there's the fear that invasive species, such as hemlock woolly adelgid, shown in this photograph, will be an additional driving factor to reduce or eliminate some of these species in Pennsylvania. On the other hand, what might increase? I don't know if we can make maple syrup out of this. I never had too much luck with it. Some species that are not in Pennsylvania at this time, or rarely in Pennsylvania, will increase and become more a part of our forest ecosystems. So in wrapping up, Earth's history leads us to a biogeographical understanding of landscapes and develops a sense of place. Do you all feel that? Okay, final thoughts. Question. What is this prairie snake doing in Penn's woods? Anybody ever wonder that? No. Well, I did. So stay tuned for a future really exciting brown bag presentation on a hypothesis in development, which might even include Noah's Ark. Thanks.